this video series, I'm going to have a chat with Shamabel Yacoub, a known economist, and Janine Starks, a known financial commentator, specifically focusing in on this issue of exit repayment in the retirement villages framework, and what's really fair for consumers, and what are some of the unfair aspects about the existing modelling used by operators. So this resident-funded model, Shamabel, appears to be socially licensed. Do you have some thoughts about how this has happened over the years and been allowed to continue to happen?
Yeah, I think it's really a kind of an accident of history. When the retirement village industry really kind of took off in New Zealand, there was not much regulation and the sector was tiny. And as it grew, it didn't have access to normal forms of capital. It had a relatively easy run of it with a few residents really wanting this high quality product. And that became the norm. And unfortunately what happens is norms are not always the best ways of doing things. Right. It was the way it was done back then because there was so much demand and there were not alternatives. But now the sector is getting bigger. Even now we're seeing this extraordinary amount of demand from people retiring, wanting this good quality product. But the model hasn't changed. And if you look at us compared to other countries around the world with similar kind of industries, what you find is we are much, much less fair in the way that we treat residents' capital, the way that we share capital gains, and there is nothing right about the way we do it. It just happens to be the way that the industry has grown, and it has almost happened in a vacuum of regulation. And a big part of that is that it's an industry that's not regulated strongly. And regulators are always catching up. That's the reality of regulation. Regulators will always catch up to the reality of today. Yes. But I think the time has come for that in the retirement village sector in New Zealand. The sector is big. There are a lot of people who are using the services. They enjoy the services. But there is a duty of care by our regulators to ensure that the rules and regulations and the practices of the industries are fair and that they're equitable to everybody.
So let me just tease that out a little bit more of this sense of duty of care and fairness. The framework as it stands seems to create a pricing structure which, for example, enables operators to repay money to consumers when a suitable replacement resident comes in. Isn't there something in that pricing mechanism which is about power imbalance?
Massively so. Yeah. Can you imagine any other transaction where somebody says, well, it's a shame that you want to sell it, I'll just find another buyer, and then we'll sort it out when I find a buyer that I like. Yeah. There are no requirements on you. But when I buy a house and sell a house, there are some pretty strict norms. Yeah. So within 28 days, you're going to make sure that this is paid unless these exceptions happen. Yeah. But that's not what's happening in this sector. So why is it that when you sell a retirement village unit, all of a sudden, none of the normal rules of commerce apply? We must have this entirely new set of rules that are all in favor of the provider.
Yeah, this is interesting to me. I might turn to Janine on this issue because one of the consumer protections that gets espoused and was espoused in the white paper was this idea that, well, you can't become a retirement village resident until you've had independent legal advice. And I'm just wondering, and I think you mentioned in your report, it seems therefore that the idea of independent legal advice is more of a convenience and something in name rather than functionality.
Yeah, it's got no function really at all. It's tokenism in terms of legal advice. If you're sitting there as a lawyer, you can look at this structure of the product, which gives all the gains to the operator. It gives you the rights only to license the property, to live in it. Everything is the pricing power has been completely dismantled and all the cash flows put over one side. Now a lawyer can see that, but they're sitting there with a client who's got no other choice, and they might not have another village in their town which shares gains or does anything more fairly. This is a big sort of oligopoly model where everybody does everything the same. So a lawyer can only give true advice if they're comparing two different products, and they'll be able to say one is better than the other. In this way, they can't financially tell the customer anything, and they're also in a predicament because you get a lot of people coming to them who are a lot older and a lot sicker than they should be in terms of getting good value out of the product.
Yes.
So this product is one where the average person lives 8 years. If somebody walks into your office as a lawyer and they've got health problems, they're already over 80, the chances of getting that kind of value out of it are very low.
Yes.
But they may have a social need, maintenance needs, they need help in some way, or just to have the security of a village. So socially it's the right thing for the lawyer to agree,
Yes.
but they know that the terms of the contract are incredibly unfair.
Do you have any comments, observations about what's happening amongst elderly consumers that might have impact on that sort of data?
Yeah, look, I think there's a few different moving parts here. One is, of course, we have a population that's aging. That's without a doubt. So our older population is growing, and it's growing rapidly, but the nature of that older population is becoming more unequal. So we're seeing more and more older people who are retiring with very little wealth, quite often without a home or a home with a mortgage. And the way that we kind of conceptualize it is the home ownership rate of a typical retiree in the 1980s and 90s used to be about 84%.
Yeah.
You fast forward 10 years, it's probably going to be 2/3. You fast forward another 10 years, it might be closer to 50%. So we are looking at a model that relies on people retiring in wealth to be able to access these retirement village options.
Yes.
But we're actually going to need a lot more variety
Yes.
of older people's accommodation in the future. And that is not going to happen if we get stuck in the current model, which is reliant on essentially using the residents' capital
Yes.
to be able to build these villages. We are going to need variety, and that is not going to happen on its own. No market will shift when the profits are there.
No.
You need an intervention of some sort, and the best kind of intervention we can make is regulatory in this instance,
Yes.
because there is a fundamental issue of equity and fairness. The current model is not fair and is not efficient and is not going to deliver the right outcomes for future residents. Why would we not plan for it now and move towards that over time?
Yes.
Yeah, one of the factors I always think about on this is we have villages that only accept homeowners into them. There's no renting model. And the reason for that is that the minute that shareholders have to put money into units that are rented out, their capital gets stuck. They don't like that. They want to roll it on to the next village and make everybody pay for the unit. But if we had a mandate where, say, in every village that was built, they had to put 1/3 of the units as a rental model, we have something more fair and equitable opening up, don't we? But you'd have to legislate for that, and that requires a different type of owner. An owner who has more capital behind them, not the current lot that we've got.
Yeah, we've got a model at the moment where it's a very thinly capitalized industry. It extract the cash out because it can.
What do we mean when we're talking about operators using a capital light model? Let's just make that clear.
Okay, so what it means is the shareholders are not having to put in too much of their own money. So when they come to develop a whole new village, the way they want it to work is that the bank loans them the money, and they buy the paddocks and the land, and they build the units, and then when the residents come along and move into those units, they're paying for them completely. So the bank loan gets recycled into the next development, and the residents have taken over from the bank loan. You get a residence loan instead. So by the time the entire thing's built, the shareholders of the company have got out with no skin in the game. They're left with owning a village, all the capital gains from it, the deferred management fee, they've made development gains, and actually other people have paid for that, starting with the banks and ending up with the residents.
If the capital light modelling is a construct of shrewd business, savvy business practice, doesn't it follow that any mandated earlier exit repayment requirement is just another type of cost that the business would need to adjust to?
Yep, it's so there are costs hitting businesses all the time, aren't there? We've got situations with interest rates, haven't we? They go up, everybody has to cope. We have construction rising at the moment. We have wages and inflation.
Yes.
This is the stuff of economists, isn't it? And that hits a business all of the time, and they have to cope with it.
Yes.
So they don't go running to their banks and say, we can't afford this. They don't go running to the building suppliers and say, we can't afford this. These are things where you have to restructure your business and either take on more capital or use some of your lines of credit to pay for these price rises. Now, you know, that's where we have if we mandate to pay out the units earlier, have what we call a buyback, it costs a bit of money.
Well, the buyback or early exit repayment, which is the same sort of idea, is sounded to me like it's actually just a cash flow consequence of any legislative change should it happen, rather than an affordability issue. Because I have seen a lot of commentary from some segments that say a mandated early repayment is unaffordable.
But let's put it this way. What they're saying is that it's okay for the residents to pay for it, but it's not okay for them to pay for it.
Right.
Because essentially, if they're not paying for the early repayment, it means it's the person who sold the property, back to the village, they're the one who are paying the cost. At the moment, it's invisible, right? It's hidden with the individuals. So what they're saying, it's fair that the resident who sold the property and has moved on, it's fair for them and their family to pay for this. But they could not possibly, these retirement villages that make so much money, it couldn't possibly be fair on them.
Yes, and they're taking all the capital gains. They have the ownership rights. So here is somebody that doesn't own the unit at all, having to behave like they do and missing out. We call it a use of money, don't we? A loss on the use of money. So if it takes 6 months to sell your unit, you haven't been able to put that money into KiwiSaver or pay off your own mortgage if it was an inheritance that your parents passed away or decided to sell the unit. You're missing out on returns. And yet you're having to do that when you don't own the unit. The operator does. And they're now complaining that they can't afford it. Yet they can afford all the other business costs that go up and down